Wonderful. Well, to our online visitors and to those who are joining us in person, welcome. No matter where you are in the world, although it looks like a lot of us are here in Bonn, I guess I will just say good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you happen to be. We're delighted that you can join us for this week's installment of the Joseph C. Miller Memorial Lecture Series at the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies. As Jan already hinted for us, my name is David Smith. I'm a doctoral researcher in church history here at the BCDSS, and I'm delighted to introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Christopher Paolella, who earned his doctorate in medieval history at the University of Missouri, Columbia in 2019. He currently teaches ancient and medieval history at Valencia College in Orlando, Florida. His research focuses on the deep history of human trafficking across North Africa and Eurasia, from late antiquity to the early modern era, and the dynamic relationships between gender, racial, socioeconomic, religious, and cultural identities that have shaped and continue to shape human trafficking patterns and activities. His recent publications include For She Is Not to Work, A Noble's Experience of Human Trafficking in the Viking Age, in Portraits of Medieval Europe, which is forthcoming from Routledge. Furthermore, his monograph, Human Trafficking in Medieval Europe, Slavery, Sexual Exploitation, and Prostitution, was recently published by Amsterdam University Press in 2020. Dr. Paolella has presented his research at major national and international conferences, including the third Global Meeting on Slavery, Past, Present, and Future in Berlin, Germany, the 82nd Annual Meeting of the Southern Historical Association in Dallas, Texas, and the 52nd Annual International Congress on Medieval Studies in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He's also delivered free public lectures and participated as a panelist in public outreach events on human trafficking awareness in Orlando, Florida, Columbia, Jefferson City, and St. Louis, Missouri. Also in Missouri, he was a member of the Research Collaborative for Human Trafficking for the Human Trafficking Task Force under the auspices of the Attorney General of the State of Missouri, and a member of local anti-human trafficking organizations in both Columbia and in St. Louis. Dr. Paolella is a well-established scholar in fields related to slavery and dependency studies, and a public intellectual of high repute, as we can already hear thus far. So therefore, we are delighted to welcome him to the BCDSS, at least in this online format, and to hear his lecture titled Against Her Will and Crying Out, Poverty and Human Trafficking in Late Medieval Europe. So with that, Dr. Paolella, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for having me. This is such a pleasure to be here. I'm honored, and thank you once again. I'm glad to see everybody is here. The purpose of this lecture is really to look at the consequences of poverty in driving human trafficking activities in the late Middle Ages. This comes out of the dissertation and the book research, and the book goes into a lot more details on the victims and survivors, the procurers, the middlemen, the pimps and bawds, if you will, the clients, the merchants, the clients who are merchants and others, and the role of the authorities in human trafficking networks. But that's a lot. We're not going to get into all of that. We're going to be looking specifically then at the consequences of poverty in driving human trafficking activities. The last thing I want to say is I am going to apologize in advance for my pronunciation of French names. And so please bear with me. If I butcher them, I apologize in advance. I should be good, but just, bear with me. So anyways, there were numerous points of entry into the sex trafficking webs of late medieval Europe. Now, although accounts of kidnapping and abduction abound in the court records and are the clearest and most obvious examples of sex trafficking, familial pressure and predatory employment were other common means of exploitation. Economic duress put women and girls into precarious circumstances. And stiff competition for limited employment opportunities in industries such as food service and hospitality, textile production and care, and domestic service, left poor women vulnerable to predatory employers. Once a victim entered the commercial sex industry, Debt and violence kept her there, and escape was difficult, but it was not impossible. In both France and England, poverty pressured mothers into prostituting their own daughters. Fathers were seldom accused of such activity, which suggests both a systemic bias against women where crimes against public morality were concerned, and also a particularly acute financial vulnerability that single mothers experienced when deprived of their husband's income. For example, in Jacques Rossiad's survey of 130 cases of sex work in Dijon between 1440 and 1540, nearly all of the women had entered sex work by the age of 17, and a third had entered before the age of 15. Of the 77 cases where the reasons for entering prostitution are recorded, only about 15% appeared to have voluntarily entered freely and without coercion. A quarter of the cases involved young women who had been sold or pressured into sex work by their families because of dire poverty. 27% of the women had been victims of public rape. And because the victims bore the shame of sexual assault, their chances for marriage were slim indeed. Faced with the prospect of a daughter without hope of economic security in marriage, families then sold them into the municipal brothel or into prostitution rings, where they might still eke out a living and relieve the household of their financial burden. In 1395, in England, Elizabeth Broiderer was accused in court testimony of trafficking her daughter among various men over the course of a single night. According to the deposition, Elizabeth, quote, brought a certain Alice, her daughter, to different men for the sake of lechery, putting her with those men in their beds at night without light, end quote. In the 1470s, Joan Chapman, the widow of a certain John Chapman of Sandown in Kent, was charged with bawdry, that is a common term for procuring, for pimping, that sort of thing, for pimping her 15-year-old daughter Alice to Flemish and German merchants in port. And in 1494, Catherine Deutschwoman, otherwise known as Dutchwoman, was accused of being a bawd or a pimp for her daughter, quote, because she, Catherine, beat her when the girl refused to visit the lodgings of a certain Lombard by whom the girl later had a child, end quote. Young single women, especially those of poor or middling status, had narrow economic prospects beyond marriage within village communities. And most of those prospects were found in cities and towns that were located far beyond the protection of their kinship networks. The search for employment was a moment of acute vulnerability for young women and girls in the late Middle Ages, who were oftentimes driven into the labor market by desperate financial circumstances. For example, in 1517 in England, a tailor by the name of John Barton stood accused of kidnapping a young woman named Joan Rawlins. Joan testified in court that she had told her patroness, the Lady of Willesden, that she wished to go to London, where servant wages were higher than they were in Aldenham, Hertfordshire, where she lived, which is about 16 miles or so northwest of Westminster. The Lady of Willesden consequently asked John Barton, an acquaintance of hers, to escort Joan to London. Mr. Barton confessed that he had met Joan on the highway as he came from services at Our Lady of Willesden. John promised to Joan, quote, to bring her to good and honest service in this city, that is London, whereupon she, putting her trust and confidence in him, went with him throughout all the city until he, unknown to her, had brought her to the Stews side, that is Southwark. So today that's the south bank of the Thames River in London. And there he left her in the house of a waterman. A waterman is a ferryman who would move you back and forth across the river. And then John went immediately to a bawd and made covenant with her to set the said maiden, that is Joan, with the said bawd. In the meantime, Joan, perceiving by the said waterman's wife that she was in such an evil-named place, knelt down on her knees and besought the wife for Our Lady's sake to help convey her to the city, which accordingly the wife did honestly into the city, and where she, Joan, now remains in honest service. So Joan escaped, but as we're going to see, that doesn't often happen. Now, because he had a history of, quote, dishonorable transactions with women, end quote, the courts imprisoned John Barton. He was later paraded through the city streets, then pilloried, and then finally expelled from the city. John's record of, quote, dishonorable transactions, end quote, suggests that he apparently trafficked semi-professionally. He clearly maintained an extensive network of personal connections in London's underworld. He knew local buyers who would conclude transactions swiftly, and he knew the local safe houses where he might surreptitiously hold his abductees in the meantime. And given the fact that John knew to bring Joan to the waterman's house, and considering this was not his first, this was considering his history of dishonorable transactions, we can then reasonably assume that Joan was not the first person the pair had trafficked. Now, even if a young woman successfully found employment, she was not out of danger. A limited market for female labor meant that competition for employment was fierce, and with little certainty of finding an alternative occupation, women could not easily leave a predatory employer. Women associated with textile work, such as those who laundered, embellished, or repaired clothing, had access to restricted male-only living spaces, such as cloisters and rectories, and therefore they were popularly associated with prostitution. The association of traditional female labor and prostitution meant that young women and girls employed in these industries were widely presumed to be promiscuous and thus were vulnerable to exploitation. For example, in 1385 in London, a certain Elizabeth Moring stood accused of operating a prostitution ring from her embroidery shop and of pimping the young women and girls who were ostensibly her apprentices. One of her victims, a young woman named Joan, not to be confused with Joan Rollins, Joan testified that Elizabeth had retained her and, quote, diverse other women and bound them to serve her in that art, that is, embroidery. Whereas in truth, she did not practice that art, but after she retained them, she exhorted said Joan and all the other women living with her and serving her to live in lechery and to go with friars, chaplains, and all others wishing to have them, end quote. Joan's testimony led to Moring's conviction on charges of bawdry, and she was eventually banished from London. In 1423, Alice in Boston was sentenced to spend an hour at the pillory for 3 consecutive market days after she was convicted of, quote, having let to hire for immoral purposes her 13-year-old apprentice, John Hammond, to diverse persons for diverse sums of money, end quote. However, the association between the textile industry and the sex industry was not completely illogical. In the city of London, authorities charged 2 prostitutes, Juliana Otticeller and Alice de Lincoln, with operating a quote-unquote disorderly house in Hosier Lane, outside of London's designated red light district, otherwise known as Cox Lane, in 1338. In 1395, a London prostitute named John Reikener, who dressed in women's clothes and assumed the identity of a woman named Eleanor, claimed in his court deposition that he had, quote, stayed at Oxford for 5 weeks before the last feast of St. Michael's. And there he had worked as an embroideress in women's clothing. And he called himself Eleanor, end quote. And that while in Oxford, he testified, quote, 3 unsuspecting scholars, one of whom was named Lord William Foxley, another Lord John, and a third Lord Walter, practiced the abominable vice with him often, end quote. We may recall that Elizabeth Broiterer was accused of trafficking her daughter, and that John Barton was a tailor and a part-time sex trafficker in 16th century London. In Paris, the 2 centers of prostitution on the right bank of the Seine, the Rue de Bayeux and the Cour Robert de Paris, were in areas known for textile production. Food service and hospitality was another industry that was both dependent upon female labor and closely associated with prostitution throughout the medieval period. And such widely held presumptions of lascivious behavior among tavern workers put employees at risk. For example, a London tavern, the Pie in Queensheath, had developed a reputation as a place which is, quote, a good shadowing for thieves, and many evil bargains have been made there, and many strumpets and pimps have their covert there in leisure to make false covenants, end quote. Municipal authorities felt it was necessary to recommend that the tavern be prohibited from operating at night in order to ensure, quote, the destruction of evil, end quote, that the pie seemed to nurture. In Kingston upon Thames, a woman named Mariana Butcher was accused of whoredom in associating with her management of a local tavern in 1434. And several years later, in 1437, she was presented before the local magistrates as, quote unquote, a strumpet. In London, William Basiloy, a taverner, was accused of pimping one Thomasina Newton from his establishment in 1470, while the servants of the Bush Tavern, Madeline and Alice, were procured by the proprietor there. And the taverness of the Ship acted as procurer for one of her own tapsters as well. But even if tavern owners didn't directly engage in sex trafficking, they could certainly facilitate such activities by turning a blind eye. By 1251 in France, for example, prostitutes, ruffians, and vagabond women, quote unquote, mulier vagabunda, were prohibited from Montpellier's taverns. Castelnaudary fined both prostitutes who ate in public houses and taverners who served them. The municipal statutes for Saint Felix prohibited prostitutes from taverns, and throughout the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the consuls of Toulouse impressed upon their successors the necessity of barring prostitutes from the city taverns. In England, in 1470, John Mand and his wife stood accused of pimping John's sister at a tavern and of having networked with other pimps and prostitutes in the other public houses, all apparently without interference from the establishments. And in 1516, a hostler from the Bell Inn in London used the neighboring alehouse as a rendezvous point to arrange a tryst between a prostitute named Elizabeth Tomlins and a priest named Gregory Keaton. Domestic service was a third industry of specialized female labor that was closely associated with sex work and trafficking. In Dijon, of the 130 known cases of sex work between 1440 and 1540, over a third involved domestic service. In Toulouse, Pierre and Catherine Fontenay were sentenced to corporal punishment and banishment from the town after conviction of pimping their 10-year-old domestic servant, Catherine, in 1474. In Paris, in 1400, Jeanne de Bougie stood accused of abducting a young girl whom she had lured into her house with the promise of employment in domestic service. During her interrogation, which included torture, Jeanne confessed to running a disorderly house and of acting as a procuress. However, when she sought royal pardon, Jeanne chose not to retract her confession, which suggests the charges may well have been true. In England, in March 1437, the letter books of London record that a couple named Richard Perrin and his wife Margaret had been committed to prison not only for generally keeping a disorderly house, but also for, quote, having enticed Isabella Poton, a maiden, from the service of one Thomas Harlow, and they carried her to their house in the parish of All Hallows Berking, and there they shut and sealed her and sold her to be debauched by George Gallyman and others against her will and crying out, end quote. In the early 1470s, a young woman named Ellen Butler was searching for a position as a domestic servant in London when a certain Thomas Bode approached her. Bode was a shrewd confidence man who used Ellen's desire for domestic employment as a pretext to lure her into his home in Southwark, where he operated a brothel. When Ellen refused to cooperate, Thomas then brought charges against her, accusing her of owing him an insurmountable debt. Although Ellen claimed coercion, the court sided with Thomas, and Ellen now faced the choice of imprisonment for delinquency or a return with Thomas to employment in his brothel. Evidently, Ellen chose imprisonment because at some point between 1473 and 1475, she petitioned the Bishop of Winchester for a release from prison, although her fate is unknown. In 1490, Agnes Hutton stood accused of bawdry for allegedly procuring and soliciting, quote, young girls and the servants of diverse men to commit the crime of fornication with diverse men, and she leads them to the chambers of Lombards, Spaniards, and Easterlings, Easterlings being Germans, end quote. At the turn of the 16th century, the Commissary Court Act books record that Robert Cliff and his wife were charged as common pimps and bawds for pimping their maidservant, Elizabeth Mountain, to, quote, diverse merchants, end quote. And they also note that several years earlier, the couple had sold their previous maid, a young girl named Agnes Smith, to, quote, Lombard merchants, end quote. We don't know, however, if this earlier sale was for a single encounter with young Agnes, or multiple encounters, or an outright permanent sale of a human being between two parties. In 1517, John Barton abducted Joan Rollins as she sought employment in domestic service in the city of London. A year later, in 1518, in the ward of Farringdon, Elizabeth Knight the wife of one John Knight, was convicted of being, quote, a bawd to a certain person who committed the foul and detestable sin of lechery in her house with a young girl of 13 years old, to the great displeasure of Almighty God, end quote. According to the proceedings, the victim testified that the wife of one Everard, a carpenter, had convinced the girl to go with Elizabeth, telling her that she would, quote, have honest service, that is, domestic service, and fair wage of said Elizabeth, end quote. The victim was then escorted to the knight's house, and upon arrival, she was sent upstairs to the bedchambers. Once inside, Elizabeth, quote, shut fast the lower door, and there she, the victim, found the said man waiting, who took her in his arms, and as she cried out, he stopped her mouth, and he had do with her against her will, end quote. The late medieval sex industry retained and compelled labor through debt and through outright coercion, intimidation, and brute force. Brothel keepers used debt to entrap women and girls in their establishment. We may recall, for example, in London, that Thomas Bode attempted to force Ellen Butler into prostitution by claiming that she owed him an insurmountable debt, and that Ellen chose imprisonment rather than work in his brothel. In Suffolk, the brothel keepers were prohibited from loaning money to their prostitutes, presumably to ensure they did not trap the women in the brothel by debt. In Dijon, Jean Sagnan, considered the city's finest mackerel during the 1460s, enjoyed the protection of both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. For 2 decades, her bathhouse at St. Philibert catered to single and married men, clerics, and the local nobility. Her girls, meanwhile, were deeply indebted to Miss Sagnan, who used their debt to trap them in her bathhouse. Jeanne herself ran in exclusive circles. She kept company with local noblewomen. She was a close friend of Jean Coustein, the valet de chambre of Duke Philippe le Bon. Her brother was a priest, allowing her to cater to the clergy and to thus enjoy the unspoken protection of local ecclesiastical authorities. Through her personal and professional networks of clients and associates, Sagnan was able to delay for years legal actions taken against her on charges of blackmail and procuring, and when she was finally brought before the courts, her trial lasted 4 years. And I should point out, she was not convicted of procuring, but rather of potion brewing and blackmail. The experience of violence when we're talking about the medieval sex industry, we have to remember is also in part the experience of violence in the urban environment. The commercial sex industry was associated with other professions known to traffic in vice and brutishness. For example, in the 1240s, Avignon banned gambling in both brothels, the homes of prostitutes, as well as in inns and in taverns. Louis IX in 1256 banned his officers from visiting both taverns and brothels. In London, in September of 1281, 29 men were accused of, quote, diverse trespasses, as for homicides, robberies, beatings, assaults with swords and bucklers, end quote. The charges also included gambling and, quote, keeping houses of ill fame, lupanaria, contrary to the peace of the Lord the King, and contrary to the ordinance and provision of the good men of the city, end quote. A 1393 municipal ordinance from London connected, quote, many and diverse affrays, broils, and ascensions, and the murders of many men, end quote, with, quote, the frequent resort of and consorting with common harlots at taverns, brew houses of hucksters, and other places of ill fame, end quote, within the city. Now, outside of confined spaces and in the open space of the street, respectable women, that is, women that did not have a questionable reputation, were generally expected to avoid making eye contact in order to preserve a sense of privacy and personal space. Men, in contrast, held their gaze up to survey that public space and to thus dominate it, as well as to remain alert for potential threats to personal safety. Prostitutions put women in an awkward position because, like quote-unquote respectable women, prostitutes were primarily concerned about their personal space. But unlike their respectable counterparts, they openly sought the intrusion of that space. Like men, prostitutes kept their gaze high in order to survey the public space, but unlike men, they invited the violation of that public space. Such intrusion brought not only the promise of economic gain, but also the risk of violence. Municipal and ecclesiastical authorities saw the invitation of the prostitute to violate personal space as a threat to the public order, and they took steps to enclose the women in institutions or zones authorized for prostitution in order to contain that threat. Of course, not every prostitute was willing to go along with such formal policies of segregation. When sex workers resisted official attempts to restrict their movement, municipalities responded by authorizing the use of force to compel compliance. Thus, the borders between reputable and disreputable neighborhoods were reinforced through state-sanctioned violence, such as the official expulsion of prostitutes from quote-unquote respectable neighborhoods throughout France over the course of the 13th century, as evidenced by both municipal and royal ordinances, or the 14th century municipal statutes of Nîmes that authorized the beating of any, quote, public woman, end quote, found outside this town's red light district. Throughout the second half of the 15th century in Dijon, with the permission of local authorities, the women of the municipal brothel repeatedly hunted down their competition, that is, freelance prostitutes, and threatened to have them forcibly carried off to the brothel if they persisted in their activities. And this is the same thing that's happening also in Nuremberg throughout the 1400s and early 1500s. In England, a case from 1382 typifies official violence, typifies official toleration of violence towards suspected prostitutes. On July 9th of that year, a certain chaplain named Thomas Norwich answered an official charge of trespassing by one Henry de Wilton. Henry claimed that Thomas had, quote, on diverse occasions between August 1st, 1381 and July 8th of 1382, by force and by arms, and against the peace, had anointed and carried away the plaintiff's wife Joan, as well as woolen and linen cloths, silver plate, dishes, pewter salt cellars, and iron and brass pots and pans, end quote. According to the court proceedings, quote, a jury brought back in a verdict that as regards the wife, she was nothing but a common strumpet, and so there was no anointing. But the defendant was in possession of certain goods belonging to the plaintiff of the value of 60 shillings. And it was considered that the defendant pay 60 shillings damages and restore the goods, in default of which he was committed to prison. End quote. In this disturbing case, Thomas faced restitution and potential prison time, not for the abduction and likely sexual assault of Joan, but for the theft of movable property. Since Joan was, quote, nothing but a common strumpet, end quote, she could not have been assaulted according to the judgment of the courts. Whether Joan engaged in prostitution is unknown, although from the proceedings it's evident that her public persona was considered disreputable. Regardless of her activities, the court records illustrate the dangers faced by trafficking victims and sex workers in general. Their marginalized social status meant susceptibility to state-sanctioned or at least officially tolerated violence, in addition to the risks inherent in their trade. Yet, authorities on occasion did act to protect sex workers from violence. In 1231 in Sicily, for example, Frederick II in his Constitutions of Melfi decreed the death penalty for the rape of a prostitute. In 1285, the authorization of the Montpellier Red Light District promised the women that they would, quote, now and forever remain under the protection of the Lord King, that is, James II of Majorca, and under the protection of the council of this town, end quote. In 1383, the Bishop of Albi suggested that the city build two brothels, one outside the walls and another inside, where the women could be housed at night for their safety and protection. Statutes across the Languedoc imposed substantial fines and occasionally corporal punishment for the rape of a prostitute throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. In 1389, in Valence and Avignon, for example, the rape of a prostitute in the municipal brothel carried a fine of 100 sous. In the 1460s, the municipal brothel of Toulouse was guarded during the day by the deputy magistrates of the city, and during the night by the captain of the watch. In Suffolk, throughout the 15th and early 16th centuries, municipal authorities, in England, in the 15th and early 16th centuries, the municipal authorities of Suffolk, Sandwich, and Southampton prohibited the managers of the stews and brothels from beating the women in their employ. Thus, in many cases, municipalities used violence to create a system of rewards and punishments that encouraged prostitutes to voluntarily cooperate in their own segregation. Inside designated zones of prostitution, the women were under official protection from violence, but outside of those zones, they were susceptible to authorized violence. Now, of course, we may ask ourselves who protected the women from their protectors, who could just as easily become their persecutors. For example, in 1304, the royal officers of Philip IV of France ejected the prostitutes living on the street of Lagouche in Beaucaire at the request of the local nobility, burghers, and the Franciscans. In Dijon, Avignon, and Lyon, sergeants in the service of the local nobility administered the local bathhouses and also ran them as informal brothels. In the 1450s, a group of unemployed mercenaries in Burgundy, the Coquillards, took up residence in the municipal brothel of Dijon, and as the self-appointed quote-unquote protectors of the women, they extorted services and large sums of coin from them. In 1456, a 26-year-old woman named Catherine caught the eye of archers in service of the Duke Philippe le Bon of Burgundy. The archers made it clear that they publicly planned to carry her off to the Dijon brothel. Under the threat of rape, Catherine chose to go to the brothel voluntarily in order to avoid the humiliation of being led there publicly. Catherine was not noted as being a prostitute in the documents. Nevertheless, her quote-unquote respectable status did not protect her from the threat of rape outside of the brothel, nor did municipal protection prevent the threat of rape therein. Violence permeated the brothel itself. In England, brothels were referred to routinely as quote-unquote disorderly houses in court proceedings that, quote, harbored men of ill fame, end quote. In London, 6 prostitutes fled the city following a pair of murders in their establishment in 1261. Edward II closed down the city brothels in 1310 because he suspected they were harboring criminals. And quote-unquote receivers in connection with those brothels were associated with sex trafficking, robberies, murders, and quote, other diverse transgressions, quote, in the city of London according to his royal decree. In the disorderly house of Ellen de Evesham in the ward of Farringdon Without in 1338, in Christmas week, last after midnight, certain foreigners from her house, that is Ellen's house, attacked a man who was passing along the highway with a light, and after felling him with blows on the head and body, bound his arms and legs and carried him within the said Ellen's house, and that she was present with a lighted candle in her hand during the assault, end quote. In 1391, the city of London issued yet another municipal ordinance prohibiting boatmen from transporting, quote, any man or woman to the stews between sunset and sunrise, nor moor his boat within 20 fathoms of the shore during that period, lest misdoers be assisted in their coming and going, end quote. In the ward of Cripplegate Without, in December of 1422, the ward's bathhouse was indicted, quote, as a nuisance and trouble to neighbors, because it is a common house of harlotry and bawdry, and a great resort of thieves and also of priests and their concubines, to the great disgrace of the city and the danger and mischief of neighbors and passers-by. In Suffolk, the Bishop of Winchester retained authority over the bathhouses in the borough as part of the Winchester liberties since the early 14th century. And under the bishop's supervision and protection, the commercial industry grew and thrived to his personal profit, the commercial sex industry, I should say. Despite ecclesiastical oversight, local and royal authorities were well aware of trafficking victims in the Suffolk baths. For example, the 14th century diverse ordinances and constitutions is explicit in its preamble that, to the great displeasure of God and to the great hurt unto the Lord King, horrible sin has multiplied. Women are being kept in brothels against their will, end quote. The brothels went on to charge the royal bailiff with weekly inspections to ensure public health in the brothels and to ensure that the women were not being beaten or held against their wishes. Direct royal intervention apparently relieved the bishop of his responsibilities as a landed magnate to manage the safety of the stews, because extant records suggest that only by the beginning of the 16th century, 150 years later, had the Episcopal See also begun to send officers into the baths to inquire if the women were being held against their will. In Suffolk and Southampton, the bawds of the stews were fined repeatedly for physically abusing their prostitutes despite municipal statutes and prohibitions. And the fact that such fines were repetitive indicate that violence within the stews was endemic and that legal remedies were quite simply ineffective. In France, violence affected both sex workers and the staff in municipal brothels. In August of 1448, Juan Soudre was working as a private security for the municipal brothel of Toulouse when he was killed in the establishment during an altercation with a certain Poncelet Pauline. In 1460, a young man from Toulouse named Guillaume Delcoume faced royal prosecution for 24 offenses, including the abduction of a young woman named Jeannette from the municipal brothel of Toulouse and her sale across the Languedoc, including Carcassonne, Narbonne, Béziers, Montpellier, Avignon, and Marseille, to his considerable profit. In 1467, the lieutenant of the provost was sued for refusing to intervene in multiple assaults and brawls in the bathhouse of Marion la Ligeoise. Now, although women and staff and patrons were vulnerable to violence, the brothel itself was also susceptible to violence during times of unrest. The brothel owned by the Lord Mayor of London, William Walsworth, was attacked in 1381 during the Peasants' Revolt, and the Dijon brothel was sacked 7 times between 1495 and 1545. In fact, cruelty, brutishness, all of this surrounded the very foundation of the Dijon municipal brothel. The establishment was founded in 1436 as a public rape epidemic scourged the city. Authorities in Dijon, as in many Western European cities, saw the founding of a red light district or a municipal brothel as the solution to a greater evil, which was the threat of violence upon quote-unquote respectable women and girls. Generally, brothels and prostitution rings catered to day laborers, craftsmen, sailors, and merchants, and members of the local nobility or their households. The day laborers, craftsmen, and sailors tended to be poor young men who had often had few prospects for marriage in an urban environment where they were in competition with their wealthier peers and older established widowers. Poor single men often targeted the women in the household of their wealthier rivals, and their bitterness and their sense of entitlement are palpable in extant court proceedings. For example, in Dijon in 1449, G. Robelin, a journeyman in the butcher's trade, shouted to a young domestic servant that he would have his pleasure with her just like her master. In 1454, a gang of 6 young men assaulted the domestic servant of an unmarried carpenter in the streets of the city. In 1505, the 16-year-old niece of the Viscount Mayor of the city was accosted in the streets by 2 journeyman masons who shouted, quote, "We are going to fuck you. We can fuck you just as well as the others," end quote. In 1535, the son of a local weaver threatened a 22-year-old domestic servant named Jacquette that he had a, quote, "a right to have a go with you, just like the others," end quote. The Dijon brothel was thus founded with the intention of providing an acceptable outlet for male entitlement and aggression, prostitutes, i.e. poor women and girls. But if the city fathers hoped that the founding of the municipal brothel would help curb the violence and the threat to the civic order, they were mistaken. The brothel did little to quell the violence. Over the next 50 years, between 1436 and 1486, there were over 125 documented cases of public rape, and as Jacques Rossiad notes, this number likely represents a mere fraction of the total assaults committed. The violence continued into Dijon well into the 16th century, nearly a century after the brothel was founded. The acts themselves were accompanied by brutality, which always included beatings, and in one case, dragging a pregnant woman through the snow-covered streets. The study then of late medieval sex trafficking makes clear that poverty and limited employments for women, economic opportunities for women, and attitudes of male entitlement all led to vulnerability and thus to victimization, as women struggled to alleviate their financial insecurity within the narrow employment options available to them. Traffickers, both noble and common, male and female, understood these constraints and skillfully exploited them in order to funnel victims into the late medieval commercial sex industry, oftentimes with the acquiescence or participation of local authorities. Once in, it was difficult to get out. Violence compelled victims to labor for an industry whose profits filled the coffers of both the municipalities and the local elite. Today, Poverty and corruption are often cited then as major underlying causes for the reemergence of slavery and the global slave trade. But neither they nor the human trafficking activities they encourage are products of modern society nor of any modern sexual revolution. No, indeed. They are instead socioeconomic conditions with deep historical roots that transcend borders, cultures, and economic systems. Thank you so much.